The moment I heard the blood-curdling screams, I knew two things for certain. First, that Karen Mitchell's HOA-sanctioned beach party had finally gone off the rails, and second, that my legal alligators were officially having a busier day than I was. Freeze frame. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how we got here. When I first bought the land by Blackthorn Lake, it was exactly the kind of place you only find by accident, tucked away at the end of a long gravel road that most folks mistook for a dead end. No big signs, no manicured entrances, no rows of beige vinyl houses lined up like tombstones. Just raw earth, towering pines, and the gentle lapping of the lake against a rocky shore that felt like it belonged to me the moment I set foot on it. I built my cabin with my own two hands, spending months shaping the timber, hammering each nail with more stubbornness than skill, until the place finally stood tall among the trees. I didn't have a neighbor for half a mile in any direction back then. My only company was the deer that wandered down to drink at sunset, the turtles that sunned themselves on the rocks, and the occasional heron that sailed overhead like some slow-motion arrow loosed from the heavens. Blackthorn Lake wasn't some polished tourist trap either. It was muddy in some spots, rocky in others, and deep enough that you could lose a body and nobody would find it for 100 years. In short, it was perfect. Or it was, until the HOA came along like a swarm of locusts and fake pearls and clip-on name tags. The first signs of trouble were subtle, the way a rattlesnake's warning is subtle before it strikes. One morning, I woke up to find a brand new sign hammered into the ground by the main road. Welcome to Blackthorn Shores Community. A deed-restricted neighborhood. I stared at it for a long time, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't sold anything. I hadn't signed anything. But while I'd been minding my business, someone had bought up a few of the old hunting cabins down the road, bulldozed them, and thrown up some lake-adjacent luxury homes. And with them came an HOA, helmed by none other than Karen Mitchell, a woman whose voice could strip paint off a wall and whose smile was about as real as a plastic Christmas tree in July. At first, they mostly kept to themselves. HOA newsletters full of cheerful lies about community cohesion started appearing in my mailbox, printed on thick, overpriced paper that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. Then came the invitations to neighborhood mixers and lakeside socials, all held suspiciously close to the waterline on land that technically wasn't even theirs. I ignored them, figuring they'd tire themselves out trying to civilize a place that had been wild since before their great-grandparents were born. But Karen was not the type to be deterred by disinterest. If anything, it seemed to fuel her. The first community event took place on a Saturday afternoon, just as the summer heat was starting to boil the air into a shimmering haze. I watched from my porch as SUVs and minivans began to clog up the narrow gravel road, engines wheezing in protest. Folding tables popped up along the lakeshore like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Loudspeakers blared saccharine country music across the water, drowning out the sound of the loons nesting in the far reeds. Grown adults in matching t-shirts trampled over the wild grasses, stringing up banners and balloons. I walked down to the edge of my property, arms crossed, and stood there like a statue, while Karen herself minced over in wedge sandals completely unsuited for the muddy terrain. "Isn't this wonderful?" she chirped, throwing her arms out like some demented game show host. "We're bringing the community together." I glanced at the battered private property sign nailed to an old oak tree and said, as politely as I could manage, "You're on my land." Karen laughed as if I'd told a charming joke and waved it off with a flick of her manicured fingers. "Oh, pish, posh, it's just a little lakeside fun. Besides, the community owns the water, right?" I opened my mouth to correct her, to explain that not only did I own the land right up to the high water mark, but I also had sole rights to any access paths that crossed it. But she was already turning away, issuing orders to her army of suburban invaders. I let the first event slide, figuring it wasn't worth the fight. Maybe they'd get it out of their system. Maybe the sun and the mosquitoes and the smell of wet, rotting algae would remind them that Blackthorn Lake wasn't the kind of place you tamed with a bounce house and a lemonade stand. But Karen's kind sees a quiet man as a blank canvas, a place to paint over with their own gaudy dreams. The next event came 2 weeks later, bigger, louder, more obnoxious. They brought jet skis this time, buzzing around like angry hornets, scaring off the nesting birds and sending waves crashing against the delicate reeds along the shore. Beer cans floated in the shallows by nightfall. Someone set off fireworks that showered sparks over the dry pines, and I spent half the night with a hose in my hand, dousing embers before they could turn the forest into a funeral pyre. By the third event, billed as the Blackthorn Summer Bash in glittery letters on a banner stretched between two crooked saplings, it was clear that Karen wasn't just organizing parties. She was staking a claim. They set up tiki bars, hauled in rented generators that rumbled and stank of diesel, and even tried to lay down sand to create a beach area along the rocky lakeshore, bulldozing centuries-old stones into a sad, lumpy imitation of a Florida resort. I caught 2 teenagers trying to spray paint one of my trees with the HOA logo. When I confronted them, they just laughed and ran back to the crowd, where Karen clapped them on the shoulders like conquering heroes. That was when I knew it was time to act. I dressed in my cleanest flannel, tucked my hair behind my ears, and attended the next HOA meeting, held in the air-conditioned model home they used for sales pitches. The room smelled like fake pine and desperation. Karen sat at the front, flanked by her loyalists, a half-dozen middle-aged warriors armed with clipboards, passive-aggressive smiles, and the unwavering conviction that property values mattered more than property rights. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, letting the chair scrape loudly against the tile. Every head turned. I laid out the facts in a voice calm enough to cut glass. The lakefront was my private property. Their events were unauthorized trespassing. Any further use would result in legal action. For a moment, silence hung in the room, brittle and thin as old paper. Then Karen laughed, a high, brittle sound that echoed off the staged walls. "Oh, come now, Mr. Lancaster," she said, flipping through her notes with theatrical exaggeration. "Surely you don't mind a little harmless fun? You're not paranoid, are you?" Laughter rippled through the room, the kind that bites. "After all," she added, leaning forward with a shark's grin, "the lake belongs to all of us in spirit, doesn't it?" I looked around at the smiling faces, the fake nods, the smug certainty that they could trample over anything they wanted as long as they called it community improvement. I said nothing. I simply gathered my papers, tipped my hat in mock courtesy, and walked out into the night. Because what Karen Mitchell and her army of well-meaning vandals didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that they hadn't just picked a fight with a grumpy old loner. They'd declared war on the one man who knew every inch of Blackthorn Lake better than they knew their own manicured lawns. And I'd spent years preparing for a different kind of party altogether, one that didn't need decorations or sound systems or HOA approval, just teeth and patience. It started with a flyer, garish neon pink, crammed into every mailbox like a wasp ready to sting. "Blackthorn Blowout." It screamed in thick, bubbly letters, complete with clippered fireworks and a cartoon alligator wearing sunglasses. "Join us for the event of the year, Beach Party Extravaganza." Beneath the obnoxious title, Karen Mitchell's name was stamped in bold, like some kind of royal decree. Free beer, jet ski races, live music, fireworks over the lake. All residents welcome. Guests, 20 wristband at entry, in tiny print at the bottom. I held the paper at arm's length like it might bite. It wasn't just bigger than her last parties. It was an all-out invasion. And she wasn't asking permission anymore. She was daring anyone to stop her. I stood there on my porch reading the flyer again and again, the late summer wind tugging at the corners, trying to tear it from my hands like the lake itself was ashamed of the thing. The day after the flyers hit mailboxes, the changes began. A crew of shirtless young men in neon vests showed up with ATVs, hauling load after load of equipment down the dirt path to the lake. Portable bars, folding stages, plastic fencing to cordon off party zones. Barrels of what I could only assume were cheap booze or overpriced mixers. When I asked one of them who had given them permission, he just grinned a greasy grin and said, "Karen said it's all good, man," and kept unloading. I called the county office to report unauthorized construction near a protected body of water. Blackthorn Lake wasn't just a muddy swimming hole. It was technically a designated wildlife area under minor conservation zoning. I expected outrage, maybe a fine, maybe an injunction. Instead, The woman on the other end of the line sighed and said, "We've had a lot of complaints about that HOA already. We're reviewing it," which is bureaucratic speak for someone's money is louder than your concern. By midweek, giant signs lined the main gravel road leading in, zip-tied to trees. Parking, 5, beach party ahead. Teenagers in neon vests set up makeshift toll booths, waving cars through like it was a county fair. All around my land, the wilderness was being chewed up by cheap plywood stages, inflatable obstacle courses, and stacks of fireworks boxes that screamed "Extreme Pyro Show" in bold block letters. I called the fire marshal next, thinking surely they'd care about someone stockpiling explosives next to ancient dry pines. But he told me, in a tone I didn't like, that Karen had submitted paperwork and self-certified fire safety compliance. Self-certified. Like giving a fox a clipboard and telling him to audit the henhouse. The real kicker came when I ran into Mr. and Mrs. Langston at the general store. Good people, long-time residents who knew better than to meddle in HOA nonsense. When I mentioned the chaos brewing, their smiles tightened like someone had cinched invisible nooses around their throats. "It's for the good of the community, Mrs." Langston said carefully, not meeting my eye. "We just have to adapt, you know." Mr. Places of Vor.com. Langston shifted awkwardly and muttered something about keeping up appearances and opportunities we can't pass up. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They weren't happy about the party. They were scared. Or worse, they were bought. My suspicions hardened when I started digging. It wasn't hard. Karen wasn't the type to hide her tracks when she thought she was untouchable. Public event permits, which should have been filed for anything involving alcohol, fireworks, or public gatherings, were missing entirely. County databases showed no records for a blackthorn blowout or any corresponding safety inspections. But tucked away under her name was a curious little LLC, Community Event Solutions LLC, founded just 4 months prior. Registered address? A P.O. box in the next town over. Listed purpose? Consulting and event management for private neighborhood associations. A consulting firm she conveniently hired at a hefty fee to organize the event for the HOA. Which meant she wasn't just planning this disaster. She was paying herself to do it. Handsomely. It got worse. Way worse. A bit more snooping, a few late-night strolls past the newly installed vendor booths, and some casual conversations with the bartenders unloading kegs, and I learned that the beer supplier, the portable stage company, even the firework technicians were all linked to Karen's friends or relatives. One guy, sweating under the sun while inflating a garish jungle-themed bounce house, let it slip without thinking. Yeah, Karen's getting a cut from every vendor she booked. Smart lady, you know? HOA thinks it's all a community service. He laughed, oblivious to the blood pounding in my ears. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was greed. Greed wrapped in glitter and flag bunting designed to make it look like civic pride. Karen had transformed Blackthorn Lake into her own private cash cow, milking every wristband, beer cup, and parking spot for personal gain, and the HOA board bought and paid for. They'd sweetened the pot by offering community improvement bonuses to any resident who signed non-disclosure agreements. Rumor was the Langstons got a new riding mower courtesy of the Beautify Blackthorn Fund. The Sawyers, whose lot bordered the temporary parking zone, got a nuisance stipend to not raise hell over the tire ruts. Even the Johnsons, the ones who used to rail against HOA overreach at every potluck, suddenly became quiet as church mice after their driveway miraculously got repaved by an anonymous donor. Meanwhile, the residents who objected, the ones like me who hadn't bent the knee, found themselves getting slapped with sudden violation notices. Grass too tall, boat trailers improperly stored, unauthorized exterior paint colors. My mailbox, the same battered black one that had stood there since I moved in, suddenly failed aesthetic compliance review. Karen's way of sending a message, adapt or else. The closer the date of the bash got, the more the lake changed. Wildlife vanished. The herons stopped nesting. The otters I used to watch at sunset moved upriver. Even the frogs, which had filled the summer nights with their lazy chorus, fell silent. In their place came drunken laughter, the shriek of power tools, the constant backfiring of dirt bikes. I felt like a ghost haunting my own land, invisible to the newcomers who stumbled through in flip-flops and tank tops, clutching six-packs and portable speakers. The worst part was knowing exactly how it would end, how it always ended when people like Karen thought they could bend nature and law to their will without consequence. I could feel the lake watching, waiting. The old rules of Blackthorn Lake didn't care about wristbands or HOA bulletins or vendor kickbacks. You respect the water, or the water reminds you who really runs things. I sat on my porch the night before the Blackthorn blowout, sipping black coffee as the generators buzzed in the distance, casting sickly yellow halos over the chaos below. Somewhere out there, among the reeds and the dark water, my alligators stirred. The party wasn't even going to survive the night. The truth is, I'd been waiting years for a night exactly like this. A lot of folks assume country living is all dirt roads and front porch rocking chairs, but out here, survival means knowing how to use the system just as well as any city lawyer. You see, about 7 years back, after a particularly nasty hurricane tore through the region and flooded half the county, the government offered incentives for private landowners willing to create registered wildlife sanctuaries. It was part of some environmental push, a way to stabilize ecosystems battered by storms and greed. Most people ignored it. Some signed up for tax breaks. Me? I saw an opportunity nobody else had the imagination to notice. I didn't just register my little patch of Blackthorn Lake as a conservation site. I filed special paperwork to designate it as a sanctuary for displaced and rescued alligators. Fully licensed, fully legal, fully protected by both state and federal environmental laws. At the time, it had seemed like a quirky footnote in the dusty filing cabinets of local bureaucracy. Tonight, it was about to become a weapon of biblical proportions. When the sun finally sank behind the trees, the temperature dropped just enough to wake the old instincts lying dormant beneath the lake's black surface. The party kicked off with the subtlety of a shotgun blast. Music thundered from giant rented speakers, a terrible mix of pop country and club beats that vibrated through the very bones of the earth. Glow sticks cracked and snapped to life around beer-soaked wrists. Jet skis screamed across the water, their engines carving deep, angry scars into the once silent lake. It wasn't long before the first idiot decided to brave the shallows. I watched from the porch, arms folded, as two guys in cargo shorts and matching sunburns staggered down the shore with tall boys in hand, hooting like chimps. They kicked off their sneakers, threw down their shirts, and charged into the water with all the grace of bowling balls thrown downhill. And that's when the gators moved. I'd seen it before, the way they lurked silent as death under the waterline, invisible unless you knew the tiny telltale signs, the faint ripple without wind, the shifting of reeds where there shouldn't be any, the brief glint of an eye just breaking the surface. The old bulls stayed back, sluggish and content in deeper waters. But the younger ones, the 6-footers with sharp teeth and quicker reflexes, were always more curious when chaos reigned. The first scream tore across the water, sharp and shrill, cutting through the music like a siren. For a moment the DJ, some poor high schooler Karen had paid under the table, hesitated, his finger hovering over the turntables. Then the screaming multiplied. A crowd formed at the water's edge, drunk and wobbling, drawn toward disaster the way moths seek out flames. Flashlights and cell phones bobbed in the darkness, casting wild jerking beams across the lake. From my porch, I saw the 2 cargo shorts kids flailing, struggling to run through waist-deep water as something dark and powerful bumped them from beneath. One of them fell, vanishing for a horrifying second before scrambling up again, screeching about a monster and something with teeth. He wasn't wrong. It only took another heartbeat before more figures splashed into the shallows, not to help, but to gawk, to film, to shout unhelpful nonsense about sharks and snakes. One girl in a bright orange bikini waded in up to her knees before shrieking and hopping backward, blood trailing down her shin where one of the juvenile gators had nipped her in curiosity. Panic hit the crowd like a match dropped into gasoline. Half of them screamed. The other half laughed drunkenly, assuming it was some kind of prank. Karen, resplendent in a glittery hostess sash, tried to restore order, clapping her hands and yelling into a pink megaphone. But the mob had no interest in authority anymore, especially not hers. Someone finally had the good sense to call 911. I know this because I heard it, not the call itself, but the rapid-fire sirens that split the night wide open, howling louder than any coyote ever dared. First came the sheriff's deputies, lights blaring, tires kicking up clouds of dust as they skidded to a halt along the lakeshore. Then the wildlife officers, 4 trucks deep, hauling airboats and emergency equipment. And then, like a cherry atop this particularly insane Sunday, a battered news van screeched onto the scene, the local ABC affiliate's logo gleaming under the floodlights. I stayed on my porch silent, sipping coffee so black it could have swallowed the stars. It was beautiful in its own horrible way, watching the slow, inevitable unraveling of Karen's masterpiece. Deputies waded into the chaos, shouting commands nobody listened to. Wildlife officers sprinted down the bank, throwing ropes and dragging frantic swimmers to safety. Flashbulbs exploded from the news crew, bathing everything in stuttering white light as reporters practically drooled over the unfolding train wreck. Multiple injuries reported at an unauthorized lake party. The reporter intoned solemnly into the camera, while behind her, shirtless partygoers slipped and fell in the mud, shrieking about gators and cursing Karen's name. It didn't take long for the narrative to shift from festive to criminal, unpermitted event, unsafe conditions, trespassing on a registered wildlife sanctuary. The word lawsuit floated through the air like a foul stench. I saw Karen trying to corral the crowd, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her glittery sash half ripped and hanging off one shoulder. She kept yelling about how she had permits, how it was community land, how none of this was her fault. Nobody was listening. A wildlife officer approached her, notebook in hand, badge gleaming. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I sat, but I saw the moment Karen realized she was in real trouble. She flinched like she'd been slapped, clutching at her chest, her mouth working soundlessly. The officer pointed toward the lake, then back toward her rented vendor tents, then toward the news van where the camera was still rolling. Karen's face twisted, fear, rage, confusion, all warring for dominance. She looked around for allies, for anyone to back her up. But the crowd that had cheered her on mere hours ago was now turning on her, fast and hungry as piranhas. Meanwhile, the gators, bless their scaly little hearts, were doing exactly what gators do, minding their own business unless provoked. The wildlife officers rounded up the younger ones with practiced ease, slipping thick ropes around their snouts and bundling them off to temporary holding tanks until they could be re-released farther upstream. The old bulls never even surfaced, too smart to get involved in such foolishness. No one died, and I'll admit, a small part of me had hoped for a more cinematic ending, but a handful of partygoers left with puncture wounds, torn calves, and enough bruised pride to last a lifetime. Paramedics loaded them onto stretchers, faces pale and silent now. The earlier beer-fueled bravado burned away under real pain and real consequences. Somewhere past midnight, after the last injured kid had been hauled off and the last generator finally fell silent, an officer trudged up my porch steps. He looked exhausted, soaked to the bone, his boots leaving muddy prints across the boards. "Mr. Lancaster," he said, tipping his hat with weary respect. "You're the registered steward of Blackthorn Lake, correct?" I nodded slowly. "That's correct, officer." "Sanctuary registration number 4782 BL filed under the Rural Wetlands Conservation Act of 2016, he smiled grimly. "Thought so. You're not in any trouble. In fact, we're probably gonna need your help sorting out whatever the hell all this is." I just sipped my coffee, savoring the bitter, beautiful taste of karma brewed slow and strong. Somewhere across the water, the last echoes of the Blackthorn blowout faded into the mist, leaving behind only wreckage, regret, and the cold, silent stare of the lake, untouched, undefeated, and waiting to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that feels like it's pressing down on the earth, daring it to flinch. I sat on my porch with my second cup of coffee, boots up on the railing, and watched the slow parade of consequences roll in. County sheriff cruisers idled along the lakeshore, deputies fanning out to take statements. Wildlife officers huddled around the confiscated fireworks and makeshift beer tents, faces grim and tired. Down by the water, A battered blackthorn blowout banner hung half-ripped from a tree, snapping in the rising wind like a flag over a conquered city. The great empire of Karen Mitchell was crumbling, and it was only the first hour of daylight. The first lawsuit hit before noon. The State Environmental Agency filed a formal complaint against the Blackthorn Shores Homeowners Association for the unlawful disturbance of a registered wildlife sanctuary. That alone carried a potential six-figure fine and mandatory restoration requirements. An hour later, the county fire marshal dropped the hammer. Multiple counts of unsafe storage and handling of explosive materials, no permits filed, and illegal pyrotechnics within a restricted fire zone. Each violation carried penalties stiff enough to bankrupt a small business or a medium-sized HOA run by amateurs who thought self-certification was as good as law. And then came the personal injury claims. By the end of the day, 6 separate lawsuits were filed by partygoers who had been nipped, knocked, or otherwise scared senseless by the alligators, most of them alleging gross negligence, reckless endangerment, and failure to ensure public safety. Karen's name was featured prominently in every single complaint, right there next to the HOA's official letterhead. The HOA board, that once proud squad of clipboard warriors, turned on each other faster than rats in a sinking ship. The treasurer resigned before lunch. The secretary posted a tearful apology on Facebook, claiming she'd been misled and bullied into approving the party. Even Karen's closest ally, one Deborah Myers of the landscaping subcommittee, fled the burning wreckage by publicly stating she had deep concerns about recent leadership decisions and was seeking legal counsel. Meanwhile, Karen tried every trick in the book. She claimed ignorance. She blamed rogue volunteers. She even tried to paint herself as a victim, sobbing into a local news camera about how she just wanted to bring joy to the community. But the evidence piled higher than the empty beer cans littering the ruined lakeshore. Photos, video footage, testimonies from vendors and partygoers alike, all confirming that Karen had not only planned the event, but had personally signed contracts, issued payments, and overruled safety objections raised by saner, recronders, Rusa testimonies. Quieter voices. I kept my distance at first, watching the carnage unfold with the satisfied detachment of a man who had already read the final chapter of the book. But when the HOA filed a desperate motion to dismiss the environmental charges by arguing that Mr. Lancaster's sanctuary was improperly registered, I knew it was time to sharpen my blade. I hired a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but a specialist from the state capitol who ate HOA boards for breakfast and flossed with their bylaws. Together, we filed a counterclaim so blisteringly thorough it made the judge raise an eyebrow during the first hearing. Our demands were simple. Full restoration of Blackthorn Lake under professional ecological supervision. Permanent revocation of any HOA authority over my property, retroactive to the moment their illegal activities began. Financial damages for trespass, defamation, harassment, and emotional distress. And finally, personal liability assigned to Karen Mitchell for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and reckless endangerment of a protected wildlife population. When Karen realized she wasn't just facing the HOA's collapse, but her own personal financial annihilation, something inside her broke. The next time I saw her, she looked like a ghost, pale, hollow-eyed, stripped of her usual armor of spray tans and manicures. She tried to smile, tried to wave, but her hand trembled midair like a bird shot out of the sky. I didn't wave back, I just watched her crumble under the weight of the empire she had built on lies. 3 months later, the Blackthorn Shores Homeowners Association ceased to exist. Bankrupt, dissolved, gone like smoke in the wind. A court-appointed trustee sold off the HOA's assets to cover the mountain of legal judgments. The fancy community center where Karen had once hosted wine nights, sold to a local bait shop. The brand-new playground, built as a community enhancement project, leased to a church group who turned it into a soup kitchen parking lot. Every shiny, overpriced amenity the HOA had used to inflate their egos was stripped away, auctioned off piece by piece, until nothing was left but dusty lots and bitter memories. As for Karen, the final nail in her coffin came when the judge ruled that she, personally, was liable for more than $500 0 in damages and restitution. Her house, the two-story monstrosity she'd bragged about every chance she got, was seized and put on the market, where it sat unloved and unwanted for months. Rumor has it she left town in the dead of night, her SUV packed to the brim, heading for some distant city where nobody knew her name and nobody cared about HOA drama. With the HOA dead and buried, my land was fully, officially mine again, free of fines, notices, and smug clipboard crusades. I took a few weeks to let the silence settle back in, to watch the wildlife return, to hear the frogs singing once more at night. And then one crisp fall morning I got to work on a little project I'd been planning since the moment the lawsuits started rolling downhill. It took a day of digging, a few bags of cement, and a whole lot of stubborn satisfaction, but by sunset it stood proudly at the entrance to the old gravel road, a brand new sign, carved deep into heavy oak and sealed against the weather. In bold, hand-painted letters, it read, "Lake Gators Refuge, no trespassing, seriously." Below that, a smaller plaque, dedicated to the memory of Blackthorn Lake's original guardians, the ones with teeth. Sometimes, when the evening mist curls low over the water and the crickets fall silent for just a heartbeat, I like to sit on the porch, drink in hand, and listen to the quiet hum of a place finally at peace. Every so often, a newcomer will drive up the road, slow down at the sign, and stare at it for a long, thoughtful moment before deciding maybe, just maybe, it's better to turn around. And if they don't, well, let's just say the residents of Lake Gators Refuge still know how to defend their home. Some with words, some with law, and some with ancient, patient jaws waiting just beneath the surface. Because around here, respect isn't something you demand with flyers or HOA bylaws. It's something you earn or else.